It's my privilege to welcome to the truth today J.T. Young. He is an author of The Unprecedented Assault: How Big Government Unleashed America's Socialist Left. He is also a author and of current events and the topics of the day, having been published by the Washington Times, the Washington Examiner, The Hill, the American Spectator, the Federalist, Washington Post, New York Post, Barron's, Forbes, Chicago Tribune, San Francisco Chronicle, and I'm out of breath. He is also a PhD from Cornell and an undergraduate degree from the University of Chicago. It is a privilege to welcome you to the show, Dr. Young.
John, it is a pleasure to be on with you today.
So tell us about the book that you've written. It certainly resonates with me. It seems like just out of nowhere, this country seems to have yielded to the left. What's that about and why?
Exactly what you're saying, John, is what provoked me to start thinking about this. As I watched, I'm sure the same current events that you've been watching kind of aghast and that your viewers are watching as well, how we could have sanctuary cities, an open border policy, a DEI that puts quotas over qualifications, an extremist environmental agenda. I had to look at each one. And as I looked at each one, I found myself thinking, this can't be real. And then with the next one that followed it, you realize, no, it's a continuation. So the more deeply I looked, the more I saw the socialist left in it. And that brought me back to what has been an age-old question for American politics the world over, which is, why is there no socialism in America? That has been the standard for America throughout our history. So I found myself coming back to asking the question, why now? Why for the first time are we seeing a meaningful socialist left, people who are not afraid of the label of being socialists, who say that they would support a socialist as president? And the answer that I came up with, and that's what this book is about, it's an explanation, is that unlike every other country in the world where you've seen a socialist left, they take power and they build a big government and to institute their programs. In this country, a big government arose underneath the socialist left. And so really the socialist left has only needs to now gain access. And what we've seen over the last 4 years with the current administration is they have given them a greater access to a greater government than has ever existed before. It's something the socialist left could never have achieved on their own, has basically been given to them. So there's really two dynamics in play. The shorter term one, which was the last 4 years and giving them access, but the longer term one, which is the growth of an enormous government that now consumes roughly 25% of the nation's GDP and is there for the micromanaging of any party that gains power. So instead of having to put in a new program, the socialist left really only needs to tweak existing programs and to direct the trillions of dollars that is being spent into areas that they favor. So that's really what the book was all about, John.
Well, I need to get a copy and read it, and I'm sorry I haven't done so prior to now, but it does sound like a very informed book that I would enjoy reading, or maybe I wouldn't enjoy it, but maybe need to read. But when I look back over my lifetime and the last 65 years of our nation and its evolution, it does seem to me that Lyndon Johnson and his Great Society is what really kicked this off. And we started giving free food, free shelter, free clothes, which got expanded into free education and then free phones and now free motor scooters to immigrants, of all things. And Newt Gingrich told me 35 years ago that the welfare system is the worst thing that could have happened to this country, because the people that are the beneficiaries don't acquire a sense of gratitude, but instead acquire a deep resentment towards the very people who are giving the money. And it seems like a sad commentary on the human condition, but I think he was absolutely right.
I agree with you, and I think that is actually the case in point with any charity, that it goes on for so long that someone becomes dependent on it, and then, as you just said, resentful that it's not a greater amount.
Yeah.
What you really need is to instill a responsibility and an opportunity for advancement, and that's the really insidious part of the current situation, which is the people that, as you rightfully say, beneficiaries, are really the greatest victims, because the system will never allow them to build real wealth or real security or real sense of accomplishment and join the greatest private sector economy that's ever existed. They're held outside of that. They're held in a public sector economy. And, they become dependent on those programs, but they can never escape from those programs. And I think just what you mentioned, and the book goes into a great detail. I agree with you completely that the Great Society programs were a watershed, and that was the tipping point. We see precedents earlier, certainly. Social Security and the New Deal, which put in an entitlement program for perpetuity and a payroll tax, which was basically just extending the income tax throughout society. But those two means were precedents for what Lyndon Johnson did in the 60s. And one of the most insidious parts of that was that not only did they put these programs together, but they consciously went and organized the people in these to lobby for more programs. They wanted an organized constituency that would support and perpetuate these programs going forward.
I'm just, I heard what you said, and I'm internalizing it a bit, and I'm surprised to hear you lump Social Security in with the Great Society. Maybe I'm misinformed, but my belief has been that I pay into Social Security so that in my later years, when I'm not able to work and provide for my family, that I would be able to have a retirement nest egg that would free me from being dependent upon the government. And that seemed to be a pretty good social device to me. Are you saying that it's morphed into something different?
What I'm saying is that Social Security took what was an entitlement program, and we'd had entitlement programs before. Veterans' pensions were common. They existed after every war, but those were always limited. They were limited to the life of the veteran, sometimes to the spouse as well. But in other words, they didn't go on. They didn't continue. And there wasn't a set aside source of funding as there was with Social Security. What I'm saying with Social Security is, and I don't want to get us, too far down the rabbit hole here, but Social Security basically said, we now are going to have an entitlement program that is perpetual. It's going to include everyone who works, and it's going to include them for their entire lives. And then there's going to be another generation that comes into the program as well. So it wasn't limited. And
But
then
don't
it
we?
added,
I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but don't we fund our own Social Security? I mean, haven't I paid a Social Security tax for the last 45 years that I have been gainfully employed? And so I thought Social Security was a trust fund that I paid in and that it grew and that then it would pay me out. And it should have, the trust fund should be much larger than the benefit, I believe. But the politicians have basically absconded with the money and have
Right.
subverted my Social Security funds for other government programs for which there is no legislative authority or was no originating governmental authority. They've only morphed it into something else and basically have gone in and taken from the savings account. Tell me if I've got it wrong.
No,
I'm not being contentious. I'm really seeking
no,
knowledge here.
no, you're absolutely right. And but it's the fiction is that we have prepaid. We have prepaid, but that money doesn't go anywhere. Like, let's say your IRA or your own personal investments where you
Yes.
invest it and that grows on its own. In the case of Social Security, which is what you just said, and it absolutely accurate, that money goes to the government. They then spend it on other programs, which allows us to run some of the deficits that we
Yes.
have
And
accrued already.
and that's how
So,
we've gotten ourselves into the crack that we find ourselves today, where we've got a $2 trillion annual budget deficit. And I keep have been thinking, I mean, since Bill Clinton, that all of this excessive government spending that Bush the elder and Obama and George W. all and Donald Trump. I'm sorry, I love Trump. You talk about never Trumper. I'm a forever Trumper, but he's just as guilty. But you need a pretty big asterisk there that a lot of his deficits were the result of a COVID pandemic, and that we either ponied up and kept this economy going, or it would have crashed like we have never seen an economy crash. So I think he gets a buy partially, but a lot of the military spending that he appropriated was also contributing to the deficit. So the point I was trying to get to is that for the last 20, 25 years, I've been waiting for the adults to show up and say, look, you can't keep spending more than you're taking in, or else it's not sustainable and it's all going to come crashing down around us. And we're going to have a bubble burst like we've never seen a bubble burst before. But the adults still don't show up. Every single time that we appoint a new speaker, they say, we're not going to do continuing resolutions. We're going to put discipline into this budgetary planning process. And they continue to go back and do the same thing that got us into the predicament that we are in. It is insanity. Please help me understand where we are and where we're headed.
well, you made a great reference to former Speaker Newt Gingrich. And
Yeah.
if you remember the revolution, which was exactly 30 years ago, and Republicans took both the House and the Senate. And I was very fortunate to be working on Capitol Hill at the time and was right there with it. And we went through government shutdowns. We went through knockdown, drag out fights with Bill Clinton, who did not want to put forth a balanced budget over 10 years. If you'll remember, that's what our goal was and our demand was. And we fought tooth and nail. And finally, Bill Clinton acceded to that. And then that unlocked what you saw, which were the last surpluses the country has run back in
Yeah.
2000. But we actually started to bring the deficit down faster than we thought we were going to. And the return that we got was just incredible. It's hard probably for people to remember, but I recall Alan Greenspan coming up to testify on Capitol Hill, where we were having real hearings about the concern that we were going to pay the national debt down, and that would then take away the Federal Reserve's ability to operate the monetary system. I mean, we were having real hearings that we were facing a crisis of having no debt.
The
Something we have.
the cynical side of me says, allow us to continue acting irresponsibly so we can justify our existence into the future. That is just craziness to me.
I mean, again, you go back and you mentioned, you raised this very well. I mean, that was just a generation ago. I mean,
Yeah.
people who are my children's age, and a little older than that, have no recollection that this happened. But we were running surpluses and running them so large that we were paying down the national debt, which is unthinkable right now. And you just mentioned, our current fiscal situation. The last fiscal year, we ran a deficit of about 6.4% of national GDP. That's how much our deficit was worth. And the only times we've run that was during the COVID disaster that you mentioned, and basically World War II. I mean, outside of that, we didn't have those, and now that's become the norm. So we're running $2 trillion deficits, as you mentioned. We're spending roughly 25% of the nation's GDP. Yeah, we cannot stay on this fiscal trajectory, and I think the recent fiscal fight, which was not necessarily on the numbers that we're talking about, but just on the continuing resolution that just was recently signed, is that there was a sense, I think, a positive here, that we're not going to accept business as usual. We're not going to have another continuing resolution that was 1,500 pages long and unveiled within a day or two before they were going to have a vote. Something no one was going to have had a chance to read. And people threw down a gauntlet, and that was the Trump transition, saying, no, we're not going to do this anymore.
Well, let me ask you about that specifically. I've obviously heard that we reduced the budget from 1,500 pages to 150. Is that a red herring? Because we expanded the debt limit and we continued to engage in deficit spending. I'm not sure I care as much about the length of the bill as I do the amount of the bill. Help me understand where I've figured this wrong.
No, I think you're right. We didn't tinker with the numbers as much as we should have. And I'm hopeful that the next administration will do in their upcoming budget, which will be released sometime in 2025. But I think here was what they could fight on within the period of time they had in which to fight, which was to say, we're going to strip out all these other unknowns, all of these earmarks, all of these things which were there strictly to appease people, to get them to vote for this resolution. And then, as you said, we came down, and the Trump administration transition said, no, we're not going to do this. And they stripped out basically everything except what they had originally promised, which is we're going to fund the government, and we're going to take care of the disaster. We're going to take care of disaster spending. So they at least they stripped it down, and the process is starting to be somewhat rationalized. The numbers, you're absolutely right. Not enough change here, but there wasn't time in which to do it. And let's be honest, do we want to have that negotiation now with a Democrat Senate, whereas next year it will be an all Republican conversation when the Republicans take control of the Senate?
Unfortunately, I have grown a bit cynical. I try and tame it. I try and keep it under control. You're right. We've got a Republican Senate, but we've still got Mitch McConnell, and he is not the majority leader. He is only the chairman of the Rules Committee, which determine which bills come to the floor of the Senate. So people may think he's gone away, but he has just shifted chairs as far as I'm concerned. Will we be able to get meaningful change in the way that our Congress does business?
I think so. I think that we are seeing, and we saw this in this last fiscal fight, short as it was, and as little as that was tangible outside of the page reduction and getting rid of all the unknowns that were in those 1,400 pages that were jettisoned. I think we are seeing the disruption that people voted for. I was looking at a poll yesterday that came out by The Economist and YouGov, and it had Trump's transition with a plus 11% favorability rating, which I know some people may think that that's not all, that's not overwhelming. But you think of a person who has been vilified for 8 full years in every way possible by every member of the mainstream media, that this is now a person who's running a plus 11 and he's still a month away from taking office. I think people voted for disruption. They voted for change. I think a lot of those people saw this fiscal fight and they see at least they're making a stand and they're making a start. And I think that's going to continue. And again, President Trump, what he did on November 5th, where he won and beat the Democrats in the popular vote, which nobody really thought was plausible as something that would happen. And the reason for that is if you look at the states of California and New York, they're so large and Democrats are so entrenched there that they run about a 4.5% popular vote advantage just on their votes in California and New York. And when you think that Trump not only erased that, but then built a majority on top of it, is, I think, to most people was shocking and a real wake-up call. And I think there are people in both parties, and there should be, who are taking note of this and saying, we cannot have business as usual. This is not, we are not going to proceed the way we have. And this is not a person here who, in the form of Donald Trump, who is going to accept that.
Well, there's no question he has a tremendous mandate. The only question that remains now is, can he tame this monster known as the federal government? And if he does, I think he'll be the most celebrated president in the history of the United States. If he doesn't, I submit that 11% approval advantage that he has will evaporate as quickly as it's arisen. So Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk say they believe that they can reduce the federal budget by $2 trillion. That's a third of the federal budget. There are two questions that causes me to ask. One is what would happen if you just instantly suck $2 trillion out of the economy? Now, if we were reducing the federal budget and returning it to the taxpayers, I would say that it would be the greatest stimulus we could ever provide. But if you just, the only way that you're going to reduce, correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm stating it as a fact, I'm really asking a question. What happens if you reduce deficits by $2 trillion, but you have to reduce spending by $2 trillion, and that money does not get back circulated back into the economy, does it?
It will stay in the economy. I think that's the key point here. Think again, we're running a $2 trillion deficit. If you cut the deficit by $2 trillion, where are we getting that money to fund that deficit? We borrow.
Well, it's monopoly money. It's just made up, which is inflationary by definition.
At some point, we have to have a real dollar, and the U.S. government borrows. That's where the deficit comes from, that we're borrowing it. And as we borrow it, we're taking that from the private sector. So that money would stay in the private sector for borrowing for private investment, which is going to be far more productive than public sector spending. So, back to your point.
I'm just trying to go ahead, finish your thought. I'm sorry.
The money stays with the private sector. The way it works right now is just because the government's not taxing that $2 trillion deficit, because obviously if they were, there wouldn't be a deficit. But because there's a $2 trillion deficit, they have to get it somehow. They're borrowing it. And they're taking that from private sector savings that could be allowed to remain within the private sector and be investment there that makes the economy more productive, makes more private sector jobs, greater efficiency in private sector usage than it certainly would be in the public sector.
Well, I'm probably showing my own naivete and lack of knowledge, but at the risk of doing so, Isn't a lot of that borrowing, though, coming from, aren't we borrowing our own money? Isn't the Federal Reserve actually loaning that money to the federal government ostensibly, and they put it on a balance sheet? And so they've got this huge debt out there, but it seems to me to be funny money. And then I understand that China owns a lot of our debt and that other nations around the world actually have bought a lot of our debt. That money is not going to flow back into the U.S. economy, is it?
Well, it can come back in the form of investment in the private sector, even from foreign entities. But also remember, money that we're not borrowing, even if the money is being lent to us from countries overseas, we then have to pay interest on that money.
Absolutely.
So that money that we're not paying interest on stays here as well. So
That I totally understand and agree with you on.
there's a real positive dynamic here. And I think, again, going back to what we saw 30 years ago when we started running surpluses and the economy was so much stronger than people thought. And we started paying down the federal debt at a rate that we didn't expect. I mean, we reached balanced budget well shorter than the 10-year projection that we were expecting. There is a positive dynamic that accelerates on itself if you give the private sector more jobs, more people working, higher wages, more productivity. And of course, that actually comes back to the government in the form of they pay taxes on that. And that further helps reduce deficits and helps offset the spending that the government has. So we are living through a negative dynamic that's making things worse and worse, getting the deficit to 6.4% of GDP. But if you reverse the dynamic, you could see this starting to accelerate going the other way, which is what we saw again 30 years ago.
Well, so I'm just not to beat a dead horse. I'm concerned that by reducing the deficit by $2 trillion, I don't know that it will happen in one day, one week, 1 month, 1 year, 2 years. I think it will be a gradual progression, but it seems to me that it could be deflationary from the sense that you're not then having that money being spent somewhere to help fuel the economy. If we were actually reducing the federal budget and it reduced the taxes that we collected, then I would readily agree that we're putting that money back into the economy and it would light the economy on fire. And so it almost seems like a two-step process to me. And maybe I'm just, not understanding the way that it works, but it seems that we've got to get the deficit eradicated first and then work on real savings that would reduce taxes that the American people pay that could then be used as for consumption. While I'm there, they're going to get. I got several thoughts running through my brain. I read that 94% of federal workers do not come to the office. Now, I run two small businesses. We have occasionally given people maternity leave and allowed them to work from home after they have the baby. We have noticed that a lot of the work actually does not get done. And while we pay them to stay at home and ostensibly work from home, a lot of the work falls to other people in the office. I'm sorry, I just am not a big believer of remote the remote workplace. Call me old fashioned. I am. I'm 71 years old, for God's sakes. But I do kind of cling to the traditional way that businesses work. And if you apply that to the federal government, 94% of the people that are employed by the government, I guess you could look at it as a good thing, because then we'd really be getting the value for the money that we spend. And God knows we don't want more government. So, but I guess what I'm trying to say is Ramaswamy and Musk are going to encounter huge pushback. And can they tame this federal government? And is it possible to get it under control?
I think it is. Again, I think what we've lacked is a desire to even try to do so.
Yes.
Certainly, there are a large number of protections that make firing a federal worker next to impossible. I mean, it can be done, but it's an arduous process. But I think that raises part of the DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency should be a part of their agenda, which is we need to streamline how people can be removed for non-performance. And I think also, too, just removing positions in government. How do we do more with less? I mean, you just mentioned being in the private sector, and everyone in the private sector knows there is a remorseless competition to be more and more efficient. How can I do what I'm doing with fewer resources, whether it's money, whether it's people, whatever it is. Oh, and then obviously there's also a pressure to do more. How can I do more? But the whole key is how can I be more efficient? And I don't think we have had a desire to do that. Our desire has always been with the federal government as like we'll just add more people. We're not going to make them more efficient.
Well, that would take us down a completely different rabbit hole. We create these government programs and they never go away. I mean, we develop them to solve a problem, and the problem gets solved or it doesn't get solved, but oftentimes it does. Like the disaster relief that we were talking about, we're going to raise this money to go help people in North Carolina and in Florida that have been victims of the hurricanes. But I will bet my last dollar on earth that unless something dramatically is changed, that those monies are going to continue to be appropriated year after year, even though we've then solved the problem of the people that have suffered through the hurricane. But I've got, well, two things. One is I think that if we just insist on January the 21st that all federal workers return to the workplace within 30 days, that you'll get a lot of attrition, and some of the problem will be self-correcting just by that one simple decree. But secondly, I've got this notion that we have got to have a cleansing of what I perceive to be a corrupt, rotten to its core federal government, or else we will never get meaningful reform. And so I would start by releasing the entirety of the JFK files. I want all the government secrets to be put on the table. And either the American people will have the backbone to stomach it or they won't. But I know that if we continue down the path that we're going, that it's not going to be sustainable. So either way, we may end up with doom and gloom, but I don't think so. I've got faith in the American people. I think we're resilient. I think we can handle the truth better than we can handle the lie. And I want to know, I do know who killed JFK. I've studied it for 65 years. I didn't think I'd ever learn it, but I read The Devil's Chessboard by David Talbot. I read The Men Who Killed Kennedy by Roger Stone. I read The Unspeakable by MacArthur. And I have now determined with what I believe to be 100% certainty that our Central Intelligence Agency with Allen Dulles planned, orchestrated, and carried out the assassination of Kennedy, that Johnson and Hoover covered it up, and many other people were knowledgeable and either complicit or complicit by their silence, and that this is a tragedy that has afflicted our country, and we're still suffering from it 65 years later. For one thing, we have signaled to every bureaucrat in the federal government that if you're in the government and you've got power, you can literally get away with murder and there are no consequences for it. And that, I submit, that has got to stop, and it's got to end right now. So we need to continue down the path, and we need to get the Epstein files. We need to know who did take a shot at President Trump in Butler, Pennsylvania, and what is the real story behind Routh in West Palm Beach. You know, there's so many linkages between Routh and this guy named Maxwell Urich, whose van was towed away from Butler. It was titled to Urich Ammunitions in Mesa, Arizona. He was named as a person of interest. Right after the attempted assassination, his name has gone completely silent. His parents filed a missing persons report on him the day after Butler. To my knowledge, he has not been seen or heard from since. We could talk for another half an hour about that, so I won't. But I'm just saying we need a cleansing in America, in my view, in order to reclaim the moral high ground and have the justification, the right to lead in the world. What's your thought, Dr. Young?
I think we do. I can't speak by it because I haven't to the two episodes that you're mentioning because I have not looked at those. But I definitely think I have looked at President Biden's pardons and commutations, and that it is concerning. And I have written an article recently, which was the point being that even if people are beyond the reach of punishment, the investigations are important. And I would add
100%.
the COVID would be one. I would add to that list. Illegal immigration is one I would add to that list. The Afghanistan withdrawal is one I would add to that list. I think over and over to see how did this happen? Who was involved? To understand what was a huge financial investment and huge sacrifices by the American people in any number of episodes as to how was this allowed to happen? What took place? How was this not known? How was it suppressed? I think we see more and more questions arising, whether it's in the case of COVID, whether it's in the case of illegal immigration. How were these things done? And I think the American people have every right to know. And the investigations are more important than the punishments because if we are going to make sure that this does not happen again, we have to know what happened in the first place.
I could not agree with you more. If Biden pardons these people as we expect that he will, and I think that the commutations really were acts of grooming, acts of warming us up to the notion that many more pardons are coming. I expect Mayorkas, Garland, Jim Biden. I think that Liz Cheney and the people on the J6 commission will be pardoned as well. That's another thing we need to add to your very good list that we need full and complete disclosure on. I think my belief, what I know to be true is that the Warren Commission was a cover-up for JFK's assassination. It was a fictional work. Alan Dulles was the only person on the Warren Commission who asked to be on the commission. Nobody else wanted any part of it. Richard Russell didn't want to be there. The other people, Ford didn't want to be on the commission. Hale Boggs did not want to be on the commission. They told Lyndon Johnson they didn't want to be on it. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court asked not to be put on the commission because he said he had his work to do at the Supreme Court and he did not have time to be on the commission and it was named for him. Colloquially, it was known as the Dulles Commission because Alan Dulles really drove the agenda of the Warren Commission. I'm taking a detour for a reason. The point I'm driving at is that to me, the January 6th commission was the Warren report for the stolen 2020 election. That was the cover-up. That was the smokescreen to divert everybody's attention away from the stolen election of 2020 and focus them on this fake, phony, made-up insurrection, which it was not. And I believe with every instinct that my body is telling me that it was an intentionally staged act. They hired a Hollywood producer, for God's sake, to produce the commission in prime time. I mean, come on, how much more knowledge or information does someone need to be able to see that it was fake and it was phony? And we need to know who did plant those bombs at the RNC and the DNC that we've never seen detonated, and nobody talks about it. Yet Kamala Harris and the Secret Service allowed her to walk right by one of the pipe bombs at the DNC, and she denies that she was even at the DNC that day. It just makes you crazy.
And I know that there was a report, and right now I'm drawing a blank on I actually think it was Representative Loudermilk
Yes,
just
he
released a report on the January 6th commission. And it makes for, I have not read the whole thing, but I've just read the highlights. But the highlights
well, he's
alone,
not done
uh,
yet. It's an ongoing look at January the 6th, and he is presenting what I believe to be the true narrative on January the 6th. And I think when we really start pulling back the layers of the onion, we're going to find out that Liz Cheney, Adam Schiff, Kinzinger, Benny Thompson flagrantly, knowingly, intentionally lied to the American people for their own greed for power. And Nancy Pelosi was the puppet master that created it. And I think they're a blight on America, and they cannot exit the stage fast enough for me. And the fact that the people of California could elect someone to the United States Senate who was censured by the entire House of Representatives is just amazing to me. These people need to go.
well, California is the keystone for the Democrat Party's power in the country, whether it's fundraising, whether it's popular votes. I had mentioned that earlier. They just run enormous vote surpluses there. There are a huge number of surplus House seats that they have over the Republicans there. California is definitely the core of the Democrats' power in the United States.
Well, and a lot of the good people in California have left and have left the state. And I wish my son, daughter-in-law, and grandbaby would likewise leave and come to sunny Florida, where the politics is good and the weather is delightful. JT Young, thank you so much for coming on with us today. It has been an absolute pleasure and delight. I hope you will come back on again and continue to inform. And I look forward to reading your writings. JT Young, PhD from Cornell, an author and political commentator. Thank you so much for your time today, and Happy New Year.
And to you, John, thank you so much for having me.